Before we delve into today's story, let's set the stage. When we talk about World War II, especially the Pacific Theater, we're talking about an entirely different kind of war. One fought not just across continents, but vast oceans, naval battles, island-hopping campaigns, sweltering jungle airstrips, and the desperate scramble for air superiority set the tone. The savage fighting around Guadalcanal, Midway, and the Solomon Islands demanded everything from those who participated. The Marine Corps in particular found itself thrown into some of the fiercest combat of the entire war. In this environment, those who flew fighter planes, like the F-4U Corsair, were sometimes the only shield between battered ships and swarms of incoming enemy aircraft. By the time America had entered the war, the Japanese Zero was already a feared adversary. It was light, maneuverable, and lethal in the hands of skilled pilots. The Allies had a steep learning curve when it came to dealing with these agile fighters. For a Marine pilot, stepping into the cockpit in the Pacific was no casual affair. It was an acceptance of possibly never coming home, a gamble with fate every single time you took off. That's the context in which Boyington would rise to command the legendary Black Sheep Squadron, officially known as VMF 214, forging his place in history and staking his claim as one of the war's most colorful aces. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Boyington's story is larger than just a war record. Even before he became Pappy, that fatherly figure, to men younger than himself, he carried within him an endless well of audacity and, to be frank, a certain appetite for chaos. Stories abound of Boyington's passion for living life on his own terms, even if that meant wrestling with authority, dancing in and out of disciplinary lines, and occasionally relying on sheer luck when he pushed boundaries too far. Many who encountered him, both in flight school and beyond, remember a man who exuded charisma but was no stranger to internal demons. Perhaps that unpredictability is why people still find Boyington's life endlessly fascinating. He was never just the heroic pilot. He was complicated. He had moments of moral failing, struggles with alcohol, disputes over the final tally of his aerial victories, and a flair for self-promotion that rubbed some the wrong way. If you listen to the few surviving anecdotes from those who flew under him, you'll often hear a genuine affection for a leader who, for all his flaws, inspired men to lay it all on the line. Maybe because they saw themselves, every imperfection, every wild spark in him. To understand what shaped this complicated figure, we need to look at the man behind the ace. Born on December 4th, 1912, Boyington's childhood was marked by instability. His mother, who later remarried, provided him with a new surname, Hall, until he eventually reclaimed his birth name. He bounced between homes in Idaho and Washington. From the outside, perhaps it seemed that he was merely another child shuffling through the Great Depression, hoping for better days. But the Great Depression was a forge. It hammered an entire generation into shapes they might never have taken under more benign circumstances. Like so many of his peers, Boyington learned to be resourceful, to hustle, and most importantly, to dream of bigger horizons. One avenue for escaping the limitations of small-town life came through education and sports. In high school, Boyington wrestled and boxed, known for being physically tough yet not always disciplined. By the time he enrolled at the University of Washington, he joined the ROTC program, which gave him his first real taste of military life. The discipline and rigor appealed to him, but so did the thrill of bending rules. He graduated in 1934 with a degree in aeronautical engineering, a sign that his fascination with flight went beyond the romantic notion of being a pilot. He wanted to understand planes from the inside out. Still, the 1930s weren't exactly brimming with job opportunities, especially for a young man without wealthy connections. He found work in various odd jobs, at one point even being a commercial pilot for a short stint, all while nursing the dream of flying for the military. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1936 as an aviation cadet, a path that would define his future. Yet Boyington's service didn't follow a straight line. Before America entered World War II, he spent some time with the legendary American Volunteer Group, AVG, famously known as the Flying Tigers out in China. That was an experience that drastically expanded his perspective. The Flying Tigers were a volunteer group funded by the Chinese government with American support to help repel the Japanese invasion in the late 1930s and early 40s. Being in China introduced Boyington to harsh realities: the cruelty of that war, the underdog spirit of the Chinese Air Force, and the sheer unpredictability of aerial combat. Even in those early days, Boyington was rumored to be a flamboyant risk-taker. One anecdote, though it's hard to confirm its every detail, describes how he once borrowed a plane for a personal mission. Another depicts him navigating dangerous flights in marginal weather for the thrill of it, perhaps showing the seeds of that boldness later displayed in the Pacific. It's also worth noting that he began to develop a taste for heavy drinking. In that era, binge drinking was far from uncommon among pilots. Stress relief, camaraderie, and the fear of never returning from the next mission often pushed them to let loose. But even within that environment, Boyington's love for a good time was noteworthy. This duality, courage in the cockpit and a certain wild streak on the ground, became part of the PAPPY persona. When the United States was thrust into war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Boyington's path took a decisive turn. He rejoined the Marines, determined to bring his increasingly honed flying skills to the fight. From a technical standpoint, the F-4U Corsair, a gull-winged fighter aircraft developed by chance vote, offered some significant advantages in speed and firepower, but it wasn't without its quirks. Landing on aircraft carriers could be perilous. The nose was so long that pilots had limited forward visibility on approach. Many Marine units ended up operating from island airstrips rather than carriers to reduce risk. Boyington, with his brazen style, took to the Corsair's raw power quite naturally. This is where we come to the legendary Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214. Officially commissioned in 1943, this unit was formed largely out of necessity. It was comprised of pilots who had been without formal assignments, either replacements or transfers, some with questionable disciplinary records, and others simply in limbo. One version of the story says Boyington sought out these misfits and shaped them into a cohesive fighting force. He became their father figure, though he was only in his early 30s. Since most of the pilots were younger, they nicknamed him Pappy. The name stuck, and so did the persona. From the get-go, the Black Sheep Squadron carved out a reputation for bold tactics. Their first missions were around the Solomon Islands, where air dominance was fiercely contested. The Japanese still had veteran air crews and formidable planes, but the Black Sheep quickly proved that they could hold their own. Under Boyington's leadership, they developed a strategy of aggression: strike first, strike fast, rely on the Corsair's speed and climb rate to climb above the Japanese planes before diving in. Even though they were newly formed, morale soared as the kill counts began to climb. Boyington himself was at the forefront, tangling with Zeros and diving headlong into dogfights that left other pilots in awe. One lesser-known anecdote from this time involves a mission over Rabaul, a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold. Boyington's unit was outnumbered, and intelligence suggested the Japanese were waiting in significant force. Several pilots reportedly balked at the idea of entering such a lethal zone. Boyington, however, insisted that the Black Sheep needed to show the enemy and their own higher command what they were made of. In a swirling furball high above the Pacific, Boyington is said to have shot down multiple aircraft. In the process, he nearly ran out of fuel due to the extended dogfighting. But with that trademark mixture of skill and sheer luck, he managed to limp back to base. That day's confrontation remains an example of how Boyington's bravado both emboldened his men and often tempted fate. Those feats soon caught the attention of American media. War correspondents loved stories of brash fighter pilots who defied odds, especially when they could be easily framed as bad boys turned heroes. Headlines shouted about the Black Sheep's victories, and Boyington found himself lionized as the squadron's star. The public wanted to believe in heroes who were unstoppable, who made the war's hardships more bearable. They wanted the aces, the daredevils who gave the home front a sense of pride and an infusion of confidence. Yet fame brought scrutiny. Boyington's claim of shooting down 28 Japanese planes would eventually stir debate. Official records sometimes clashed with personal recollections, and some kills were likely shared with other pilots or were unconfirmed. Nevertheless, the Marines recognized his accomplishments and awarded him the Medal of Honor, among many other distinctions. The legend was cemented. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, the top-scoring Marine Corps ace, at least by one accounting, leading a band of misfits known for their devil-may-care spirit. But the war had its own plans for Boyington, and fate would intervene at the height of his notoriety. In January 1944, during a mission near Rabaul, one of the most heavily defended Japanese bastions, Boyington's luck ran out. He was shot down. For hours, he was listed as missing in action. Initially, his comrades and the American press believed he was likely killed, but in truth, he had survived a harrowing crash into the ocean, only to be picked up by a Japanese submarine. From there, he was taken as a prisoner of war. Boyington spent nearly 2 years in captivity, primarily in the Omori, and later the Ofuna prisoner of war camps near Tokyo. Surviving as a POW in Japan was no easy feat. Food was scarce, harsh interrogations were common, and the psychological toll was immense. Some American prisoners endured forced labor, disease, and severe malnutrition. For Boyington, used to the open skies, the sense of confinement was crushing. He later recounted how he would make sketches or daydream about flying to keep his spirit alive. He also described bitter regret and reflection during his POW days, wondering if he'd ever return home, if the legend he'd built would matter, or if his life was simply destined to end behind barbed wire. Amid these bleak circumstances, fellow prisoners recalled that Boyington's rebellious streak sometimes put him in further jeopardy. He was not one to simply bow to authority, and yet, in these camps, defiance carried brutal consequences. There are stories of him risking punishment to share extra morsels of food with weaker prisoners, or to maintain morale by cracking irreverent jokes at the guards' expense. Such acts of camaraderie may seem small, but in a POW camp they could be the difference between mental resilience and despair. Finally, in late August 1945, with Japan's surrender, Boyington was liberated. Many Americans, including his fellow Black Sheep, were astonished to learn he was alive. In the swirl of post-war celebrations, Boyington's return was front-page news. He was greeted as a hero, awarded the Medal of Honor in a belated ceremony, and feted by admirers who saw in him the perfect embodiment of the fearless Marine aviator. Yet the man who came back was not entirely the same Pappy who disappeared. War and captivity had taken a profound physical and psychological toll. What's more, the abrupt shift from captivity to instant fame brought its own sense of disorientation. In the years following the war, Boyington struggled to find a foothold in peacetime society. Like so many veterans, he wrestled with trauma, and his inclination to drink heavily grew worse. Post-war America might have celebrated its returning heroes, but it didn't always provide the kind of emotional or medical support that we might expect today. Boyington found odd jobs, tried to capitalize on his fame through appearances and interviews, and eventually penned his autobiography, Baa Baa Black Sheep. In it, he laid bare both his achievements and his struggles, giving readers a raw look into the life of a man who was at once heroic and deeply flawed. If one flips through the pages of Baa Baa Black Sheep, you'll find more than just war stories. You'll sense the bitterness Boyington felt about certain aspects of military bureaucracy, about how some of his claims were questioned, and about the personal demons he battled. Yet you also hear the humor, the pride, and the unstoppable spirit that kept him alive in the Pacific sky and through the nightmare of prison camps. It's that unvarnished candor that resonated with many readers. He didn't pretend to be the perfect hero. He just told it like it was. Then came the 1970s TV series, also titled Baa Baa Black Sheep, later known in syndication as Black Sheep Squadron. The show was a fictionalized account of Boyington and his men, portraying them as lovable rogues who buck authority yet come through in the clutch. While it took more than a few liberties with historical accuracy, the series brought Boyington's name back into the cultural mainstream. He served as a technical advisor at times, though he was known to quibble with some of the show's more outlandish storylines. Still, he recognized the value of public interest, occasionally making cameo appearances or offering commentary. The revival of his war stories on television only heightened the ongoing controversies about his kill total. Some historians argue that certain kills credited to him may have been duplicates or shared with other pilots. The official Marine Corps records were, at times, incomplete or contradictory. Boyington himself argued that 28 enemy planes were brought down under his guns. Others pegged the number at 22 or 24. For the general public, the precise number might not have mattered as much as the mystique of Boyington's combat exploits. Yet for some in the aviation history community, it became a point of contention. Did the Marine Corps celebrate a legend whose numbers didn't add up? Or was the real story more nuanced? There were also personal controversies. Boyington's behavior off-duty had drawn criticism from fellow officers, and his turbulent personal life, including multiple marriages and divorces, provided ample fodder for gossip. He sometimes came across as brash, outspoken, or even self-serving in interviews. But behind the public persona was a man who had seen too much war. He struggled with the demands of the spotlight and never fully escaped the cycles of drinking and financial instability that dogged his later years. Yet even with all the friction, many of the men who served under Boyington defended him passionately. Interviews conducted decades after the war reveal a loyalty that is as telling as any statistic. They describe a commander who, in the fury of battle, never hesitated to lead from the front. He wasn't someone who orchestrated things safely from the rear. He was in the thick of it, living and dying by the same odds as any other pilot in the squadron. That, more than any official record, explains the bond and gratitude they felt. By the final chapters of his life, Boyington had become something of a living legend on the veteran speaking circuit. He would show up to events, sometimes with a twinkle in his eye, eager to share stories, though occasionally repeating the same war anecdotes. He came across as a man both proud of his legacy and haunted by it. The physical toll of war, POW life, and years of hard living couldn't be ignored. In his later years, he confronted a diagnosis of cancer, ultimately succumbing to complications in 1988. The news of his passing briefly made headlines around the country, and in a gesture reserved for those who served with distinction, he was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, among countless other American heroes. One lesser-known detail about his funeral is that, at the service, some of his old squadron mates and a few younger Marines gathered to remember the man behind the legend. While the official ceremony was steeped in tradition and respect, the informal stories told afterward were anything but solemn. They recounted the time he went AWOL to join a poker game, or the time he nearly started a brawl in a bar in Honolulu. There were belly laughs in that retelling of his escapades, tears when remembering how he cared for his men, and a strange acceptance that the man was irreducible to any single narrative. In remembering Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, we remember not only his 28 or possibly fewer aerial victories or the swagger of a legendary squadron commander. We also remember the kid from Idaho who dreamed of flight, the POW who wondered if he'd ever taste freedom again, and the flawed yet undeniably brave Marine aviator who became a symbol, sometimes larger than life, of American grit. There's a timeless resonance in his story. Heroism doesn't mean perfection, and those who reach the loftiest heights often carry the deepest scars. At the close of this journey, perhaps what lingers is a sense of humanity. Boyington reminds us that even the greatest aces and war heroes are, at the end of it all, men and women with hopes, fears, and failings. This doesn't diminish their feats, it illuminates them. It helps us see that courage can coexist with inner turmoil, that leadership can shine through personal chaos, and that the line between legendary and mortal is often blurry. For the generation that fought World War II, as well as for the generations that look back on that time, Gregory "Pappy" Boyington's story offers both caution and inspiration. It warns us to be mindful of our heroes' humanity and inspires us to realize that extraordinary achievements can spring from individuals who don't always follow the rules, who sometimes stumble, and who persist against all odds. And that's all for today's video. If you liked this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.